Hello and welcome back to another video with dee'stuition. Today we'll be looking at the poem Checking Out Me History by John Agard, and that is part of the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. Let's get into it. So, first of all, an overview of this absolutely fantastic poem and definitely one of my favourites from the anthology. So the poem is written as a first person account and it's basically a dramatic monologue, and you will know from your study of literature that a monologue is basically where the speaker is giving their truths, their emotions, their feelings, and really expressing themselves in a vulnerable way, usually to an audience. And the speaker is actually John Agard himself, and he's recounting his relationship with the British and Guyanese education systems. The poem highlights the importance of knowing one's history and also the links between one's history and one's identity and how you see yourself. And the speaker seems particularly perturbed about the fact that things have been hidden from him. He has not been able to access all aspects of his history. He has not been able to celebrate all aspects of his history because, unfortunately, history is often taught through a colonial lens. And what we mean by a colonial lens is it's taught by the people that colonize other countries rather than being taught by the leaders of the country themselves. So in terms of the context of the poem then, really important stuff. So first of all, John Agard is a mixed heritage man. He is very much still alive as well. And if you do get a chance to hear him read any poetry, it's definitely well worth it. I have a couple of times. He's half black and he's half white. His black heritage is Black Caribbean. Guyana is often seen as South American, but it is still very much part of the Caribbean in terms of culture and food and so on. And his white side is Portuguese, which is again very important because the Portuguese had quite a lot of involvement in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. So his the two halves of himself, if you like, they are very closely linked and have a deep and rich interlinking history. Donagard moved to the UK in his early 20s, so he didn't actually do his schooling here, but he did take up some other education here, further education. And basically, the poem talks about a wide variety of Black and non-white important historical heroes and figures, and they are mentioned because of the fact that often their efforts are not celebrated and certainly aren't as notoriously wide known as some of their white counterparts. And there are so many heroes that are celebrated within this poem. And it's really important that when you are studying this poem, that you pick out a few of those heroes and really try to understand what their impact was on the countries that they came from and what their impact was in a wider sense as well. There were also a variety of fictional and non-fictional British characters and heroes that I mentioned. So, for instance, he talks about nursery rhymes and people that are very famous in nursery rhymes, which of course are fictional characters. And then he also talks about non-fictional characters who are widely celebrated for their efforts. And this is juxtaposed with the black and non-white heroes who have pretty much done similar or sometimes exactly the same thing, but haven't unfortunately received the same amount of recognition and notoriety. So, in terms of the key quotations, then I've picked out for this poem, and it's quite difficult to pick out key quotations for this one because there are so many different things and people mentioned. And I think that's sometimes where students struggle a little bit. So hopefully these key quotations will just really help you to hone in on the main and important parts of this poem and really be able to say a selection of things during your exam process. So the first key quotation is "Dem tell me, dem tell me." Now, dem tell me is not only the beginning of the poem, which of course really highlights the importance of the words that he wants to say, but he chooses to use his Caribbean dialect. He chooses to use the word them rather than the standard English them, and that really celebrates his culture, and it lets the reader know from the very beginning that he's very proud of who he is, he's proud of where he comes from, he's proud of the way that he speaks. And then, of course, you've got that verb tell me. Now, of course, when he's talking about them tell me, he's talking about the fact that information that he's given, information that he's been able to access throughout his life, his educational experiences, have all been chosen by a certain group. The them and the tell are really interlinked there, because when he's talking about them, what he's really talking about there is European leaders, the leaders who design the curriculums in countries where they actually have very little to do with. And then the second key quotation is blind me to my own identity. Now, this particular quotation again is really, really important. It is a metaphor. And essentially, what he's saying here is that his own history is being used against him. He feels like he is literally blind because there is so much about himself that he just doesn't know. There's so much about his identity that is not been privy to, unfortunately, because of the fact that other people don't see it as important. So unfortunately, he's not been able to access that at all. And then you've got that noun identity. Now, identity, of course, has lots of connotations, but essentially, your identity is who you are and how you see yourself. And unfortunately, what he's saying here is that he often doesn't know who he is or how to see himself because of the fact that he doesn't really know his history and it's being kept from him. The third quotation is, "Them never tell me about Mary C. Cole." Now, you can do your own research on Mary C. Cole. She's a very important Black historical figure. And if you've ever heard of Florence Nightingale, which the likelihood is you probably have, Mary C. Cole essentially did very similar things to Florence Nightingale. So Mary C. Cole actually went and helped out during the Crimean War. Now, you should have heard of the Crimean War because of the poem Charge of the Light Brigade, and we'll be doing a video on that very shortly. But during the Crimean War, she went to go and help soldiers to save lives, basically. She was there on the front line, being a nurse, looking after soldiers, and trying her best to make a difference. She was not wanted. The British did not want her there as a result of racism, but it didn't stop her anyway. She still continued to go and she still continued to make a difference. And that is why he celebrates her there. And what he's saying is that although Mary did such a similar thing to Florence Nightingale, she's rarely mentioned. And then you've got the quote, "Them telling me about Dick Whittington and he cat." Now, Dick Whittington is a fictional folklore which is based loosely on a real British person. Now, what he's essentially saying here is, why is it that I'm being told about fictional characters, fictional meaning, not real, and essentially not as important as actual historical figures who I should be learning about. And you can sort of hear in his tone there's a sense of annoyance. He's quite perturbed about the fact that his education is focusing on somebody who has very little importance and relevance to him in his identity. And yet people that do have so much relevance to his identity are often forgotten. And then finally, you've got I carving out my identity, and you've got this metaphorical phrase here, as well as that really important verb, carving. Now, what essentially he's saying here is he's going to put that work and that effort in to find out who he is. Nobody is trying to help him do that during his education, but he is going to find out who he is. He's going to put that effort in, and that verb carving is really powerful, and it really shows that everything he's doing is intentional. He wants to know who he is, and he wants to know where he's from, and he wants to know important figures that have had an impact on his own history and his own identity. So, a couple of key takeaways from the poem then. First of all, everyone should have the opportunity to explore their history. Now, you would probably assume that if you're from a country in the Caribbean or even a country on the African continent, then you would have the opportunity to explore local, regional heroes. But unfortunately, because of colonialism, what you often find is that the curriculum design in schools still focuses heavily on European figures rather than figures from their own culture. And therefore, unfortunately, people miss out on knowing about things that are very closely linked to their identity. As well, it's this idea about knowledge being power. If you take away somebody's knowledge, you are essentially taking away their power, especially if it's knowledge of self. Thirdly, a lack of knowledge keeps conflicts alive. So if people do not understand and know how other races and other cultures have contributed to society, you can often have this disparity and feel like one race or one culture or one country is superior to another. And that, of course, keeps conflicts well and truly alive. And then you've got that the government should use their power in more positive ways via the education system. So it's just really important that individual governments really focus on using their power to empower the young people who are currently in the educational systems that want to and need to learn more about themselves. And finally, the takeaway is that colonialism has far-reaching effects. Colonialism affects people for generations, and Agard's really trying to hone in on this and really trying to show the effect that it has on people and how they see themselves. So that's it for this poem then. If you have any questions on the poem, please drop me a comment and I will do my best to answer any questions. If you feel that we need a follow-up, if you'd like to know a little bit more about the heroes that Agard mentions, do let me know and I will make that happen. Thank you and I'll see you in the next video.